Hello, welcome to Dead and Buried. My name is Kurt. Now, in the lead up to the Resident Evil 3 remake coming out in April this year, 2020 if you're watching in the future, I'm going to be reviewing all 6 of the live action Resident Evil movies, as well as the 3 animated ones. But without further ado, let's get into the review for the first live action Resident Evil movie. Resident Evil came out in 2002 and was released to a fairly negative critical reception with an aggregate critic score of 36% on Rotten Tomatoes. Audiences were a bit more receptive to the first film in the franchise, despite the series going downhill from here in regards to both critic scores and audience scores. And I really think that it's a shame from a critical point of view that the series went downhill, because a lot of people lumped the first film in the franchise in with the rest of them, which is understandable, but the first film, from a critical standpoint, is just miles ahead of the other films in the franchise. And I think the first Resident Evil movie is actually one of the better video game movies, along with the likes of Silent Hill. The movie was filmed on a $33 million budget and went on to gross $103 million at the international box office. It then went on to get 5 sequels, with a reboot on the way being written and directed by Johannes Roberts. And to be perfectly honest with you, I'm actually incredibly surprised that this movie got sequels, because it's not a major profit at the box office. But I could just be used to every second movie at the box office making $1 billion nowadays. Making 3 times its budget was obviously more than enough for Sony to greenlight a sequel. Now, I want to start with the positives for the movie. The film score is fantastic. It has this grungy sci-fi vibe that really helps set the scene for the movie, and was created by Marco Beltrami and Marilyn Manson. Yep, that Marilyn Manson. Now, even if you don't know anything about Resident Evil, the opening scenes of this movie do a really good job of conveying the sci-fi horror that we're about to get into. I wish some of the later films were a bit more restrained, like this first film in the series, as this really does feel like a sci-fi horror, whereas some of the later movies feel a bit more like sci-fi action movies, despite one of the later movies being my favorite film in the franchise and actually one of my favorite movies of all time. Now, Resident Evil does a very good job of building tension and has a good variety of monsters that were available in the games that were released at the time, showcasing zombies, zombie dogs, and lickers. Now, the set design is very good. Everything that looks large and clunky and should sound large and clunky feels like it's large and clunky. Large metal doors slam shut with the weight that they should, and this movie doesn't follow the traditional sci-fi trope of large automatic doors shutting and opening as if they're made of cheap wood, because they usually are. The movie is also a really good length, with the right timing for most of the duration. No scene drags on too long, and except for a couple of weird cuts here and there, it doesn't feel like it's rushing to get to the end of the movie. Now, the cool scene of the movie starts about half an hour in and starts the Resident Evil movie tradition of laser grid corridors. And last of the positives, it has pretty good gore effects. I was relatively happy with it. For a movie that's not particularly scary, I'm glad the gore was somewhat decent. Next up are the negatives. The acting is pretty average, with no real standouts. Even scenes that are meant to come across as quite emotional can fall very flat. The movie's also not really scary. The closest it comes is with some jump scares, but I, along with many other horror fans, don't really consider jump scares to be scary or really valid, because they feel very cheap. Now, unfortunately, this movie starts the floaty wire stunts that the later movies in the franchise really become known for, especially the second and fourth entries in the live action film franchise. And the fourth film is my favorite of the Resident Evil movies, but the wire stunts in that movie are horrendous. And the last negative I have for this movie is that some transitions are pretty rough, including one scene where 2 characters are talking and it randomly just cuts to them running away from a swarm of zombies, which it doesn't even show a zombie walking into the room that they're having a conversation in, which would have helped set up the transition. Now, these movies in general aren't very good, so what I'm going to be doing for the Resident Evil film series is I'll be giving a general audience score from a more critical point of view, and I'll also be giving a personal enjoyment score for how much I personally enjoy these movies, because they're a bit of a guilty pleasure of mine. So for my audience review score, I give the first Resident Evil movie a 7 out of 10, and for my personal enjoyment score, I give the first Resident Evil movie an 8 out of 10. I hope you guys enjoyed my Resident Evil movie review. I really want to see what other people in the horror and Resident Evil film community think about this movie, especially as I think for general audiences it unfairly gets lumped in with the worst films that come later in the series, and I just want to see what other people think apart from the general internet communities about this movie. Thanks for watching, and I hope you guys have a good one. See ya.